I'd just like to say hello to everyone today. It's really nice to have the opportunity to share my experiences of working with a team of social scientists and natural scientists in Brazil, and in particular in a location called Guapiravu, which is in the Atlantic forest of the eastern seaboard side of Brazil. What I want to do today is just share my experiences, our experiences of trying to develop a project around citizen science, which we would hope will be transformational in the way in which the school children within this area of the Atlantic forest around Guapiravu understand their own environment, understand how they live within the forest, which is their home, and which is where their parents grow produce, and which becomes a significant part of their educational experience through the schooling that they have in that area. What I want to talk to is how we've worked with these school children to introduce them to the idea of the environment and climate change, and to make it meaningful to them so that they have a better appreciation of why it is important that they protect the location that they currently live. So this story is about citizenship, and in particular how we build citizenship for those children to engage in education, because we can't take it for granted. And that's a big part of what I want to talk to here, is how do you create the context for citizen science? We may take it for granted in the Western world that you can engage in counting birds in the back garden for the RSPCA, but our story is a very different story. And as I say, it's a story about building citizenship. In working through that story, I also want to take a moment at the end of the presentation to consider the relevance of what we've tried to do in Brazil as an example of responsible innovation. What does our experience of creating that context for citizen science, how does that inform our understanding of what responsible innovation is? And by responsible innovation, I mean an innovation project that is socially desirable with a positive public impact. But who's it impactful to? Who's it positive for? Are these simple observations, or is it far more complex than that? And I guess what I'm trying to infer here is that it's actually far more complex, and science is inherently political. And I want to talk to those themes at the end of this presentation. So that's the overview. Environmental crisis. How do we work with communities that are really badly affected by the environmental crisis to better engage and better understand their relationship with nature? And what does that project look like? And can it be responsible? And in what way is it responsible? So let me start by just setting out the context of the work that we've been doing. So as I say, we're working with school children in the rural community of Guapiravu, which is on the Atlantic forest. And what's perhaps remarkable or surprising is that in the work that we've conducted in that community, and I'll explain how we got into the community in a moment as we go through the presentation, but what was remarkable about the kind of work that we've done is the extent to which the children were actually quite unaware that there was really a climate crisis or environmental crisis, or if they were aware, it didn't really seem to resonate with them in terms of their local experience. You know, how does it affect us? Why is it important to us? We were also quite surprised that the children didn't really realize that they lived in a biodiversity hotspot, second only to the Amazon, and that where they lived in their houses within the forest was of global significance when we think about populations of frogs and toads and reptiles. And so there was a real sense of disconnect between sort of the public dialogue that's taking place and how these individuals really uh, um, made sense of it or even connected to it in any way. But of course, it's significant because these are the children that will become the adults that will be farming and producing food in the forest, and then who have a very significant impact on the sustainability of that environment and that forest. And so as a team, we felt it was important that we, engaged with these children in order for them to be good, hopefully, citizens in the future, or at least engage them into why we think it is of significance that they really understand their relationship with the forest. Again, what was interesting is this disconnect with the children and the forest, given that they live in the forest and given that they're educated in the forest, in schools, but again, that what they were taught was not really reflecting what was happening literally on the ground. And anecdotally, from many of the elders within the community and the leaders of the cooperative movements who we were talking to at this time, was the fear that the forest was becoming a desert, that the use of pesticides and the forest degradation was having a significant impact, and that this would ultimately, shape and have a detrimental effect on the produce of food and the resilience and survival of the community. And again, it was this disconnect which was concerning of the elders and the community leaders and the members of the local cooperative, which was the main organisation that coordinated the farmers within that rural community. So our conversations led us to really think about how we might engage with that, the people within Gopuravu, the farmers, the elders, and particularly the children, because there was no sense that they had a role. In fact, they didn't understand that they might even be given a role, or they could take a role in making a difference to the survival of the Atlantic forest and the part of that they lived in, and that this really would be significant for their futures. And so we saw there the potential. Now, how we got to have this conversation, and I'll quickly introduce this here because it might seem rather odd that I'm talking to community without you knowing how we got there. I was very fortunate had to be working collaboratively with colleagues in a business school in Sao Paulo, FGV, and had made good friendships and working relationships with a number of public administrators within that school. And one of them had a very good PhD student who I was introduced to and had over to Cardiff as a student to host and mentor for several months. This guy, Fabio Grigoletti, he introduced me to Gopuravu through his PhD. And so we had an insight into what was going on around land reform in that village. And it's from that point that we begin to build a relationship around working in that locale around citizen science. I raise it now because at the end, I really want to talk about the significance of building projects that are responsible in the way innovation, such as this citizen science innovation is introduced, is important, because it really does talk to this idea of how we make sense of the public impact, how we understand it, how we understand context, and how you work with communities in order for you to begin to navigate the complexities and tensions within that. So given that we have access to Gopuravu, and given the relationship that Fabio had built with other colleagues from FGV within that locale, including master students, it was a place where there's a lot of activity with the academics. The simple idea, and at this point, it isn't simple, of course, but the simple idea is that we would find ways to enable the children to begin to connect with the forest, to understand why it mattered. They really didn't understand that at this point. And we're talking about children between the ages of 7, 8, through to 16, 17. We had a wide scope of, who could we talk to? We needed to find out what was the best way to do this. And for us, it was to engage them initially outside the classroom, in the community, literally in the community hall, to create a communal space where, for us as social scientists, because where we are at the moment, when we were engaged talking with them, was social science led. We were public administrators, innovation scholar, myself, just interested in how we can create a dialogue around enabling the children to build that identity with the forest, to really understand the fauna and flora. And we felt that citizen science would be a good way because it would allow them to actively engage. And this is where the transformational element of citizen science fits with our story around education, which is this inquiry-led approach, which is it's based around research-led questions that scientists set, create a methodology, and the children with the scientists go into the field literally and collect data. And we wanted that to be a key part of this communication, this identity engagement. If they could understand and be part of monitoring the health of the forest, then we felt that created the right context for when hopefully this work would then be fed in to curricular development in the classroom. So we wanted to build the community sense outside the classroom, and then that would permeate through into their own lessons throughout their time at school. And so we were not just thinking about this in terms of just talking to the kids here and now, but this is a long-term project about building material that can feed into curricular development. And of course, this has all implications for the positive public impact that responsible innovation is meant to bring. But again, these intentions, are they readily translatable into something tangible later on? Anyway, the idea was, as I say, was to build a citizen science project within Grappiravu, enabling the kids to discover, to better understand the forest, and also to work with scientists, to work with educationalists, to work with researchers, to widen their horizons, to get a better sense of the significance of not only where they live, but actually how they engage with education in its various facets, not just school teachers, but researchers, undergrads, postgrads, doctoral students, etc. This picture here, there's a little story behind this boa constrictor. So this boa constrictor has been lost for about 64 years or so. And I'm sure I'm right in telling this story as it is, and it's not quite as tragic as it sounds, although it's pretty tragic. The first time that this particular boa constrictor was found by a local resident of Grappiravu, and it was in their front garden, and the individual proceeded to hit it over the head with a broom, which probably isn't great. Fortunately, scientists found more than one specimen, but it is indicative of the fact that this space is really incredibly special. It's special in terms of frogs and toads. It's probably got the most important and significant range of species and habitats for a range of frogs and toads throughout the globe, and it is home for many very rare reptiles if they're lucky enough to survive the local broom. But it's really important, and we felt that was a really neat story to engage the children with, because if you talk to some of the youth, they would talk about frogs and toads as things to squash. There was no sense of why it was really important to protect the animals and the habitat. Now, it's because we work in Grappiravu that I really think it's important to emphasize that this is a social science-led project. And I'll talk about the detail of the project in due course, but it's social science-led because of the context within which we find Grappiravu. And key to that is our ability or our recognition that not only are the children unprepared or unaware of the significance, but they live in a community which has very poor citizenship rights. And we can't just assume that we're going to introduce this project and give them a sheet to count frogs or whatever it might be, and that they'll engage and they'll understand what's going on and they'll be interested. It's not it's not the same as you might expect, say, if you're engaged in school children in the UK. There is the educational curricula is perhaps more inclusive in that sense. And so what we felt, given the work that Fabio had been involved in looking at land reform in the community throughout his PhD, was that we had a pretty good understanding of the contextual limitations around education, whether it's formally in terms of the actual educational curricula, but also the attitudes of the children in terms of, why is this relevant to me, and why should I be, why am I being asked this? So from the social science-led perspective, we really felt it necessary to create that context for science to flourish, for kids to understand why inquiry-led learning, research-based, responding to research questions, collecting data, building a case study, feeding that back into their own studies and learning is important. So what I will come on to is how we've tried to build that citizenship. It's because that we're working within very difficult terrain. This is a rainforest. It's wet, incredibly wet for most of the time. It's very difficult to maneuver around. And so it's a challenge to involve the children in collecting data, but it's also a significant challenge in just being able to record and process and develop. The community is at least 6 hours from Sao Paulo. I've done the trip many times. The last hour is on an untarmac road. It breaks your back every time you go to the place. And so in thinking about developing this citizen science project, we felt there was a real opportunity to develop a technical infrastructure that would allow the kids to simply collect data, for the scientists to more readily download it, to make it in a far more usable process. And in that sense, we've included colleagues from Cardiff and Sao Paulo in the development of this communications infrastructure. And that's been really interesting and challenging to me as a non-computer scientist to appreciate the difficulties of working within a rainforest as a computer scientist. And that's been really excellent, because it's allowed us to really think innovatively about the project and how it links to the scientists. But it's also been really insightful, because we've been able to involve the youth, the school children, in the testing and development of that technology. In other words, when we look at citizen science through our optics, not only are we trying to build citizenship through dialogue, in trying to create a communal space, but we're filling that communal space. And by filling it, I mean we're introducing technology that they themselves are co-creating. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. And then, of course, we need our ecologists, because we need to build research projects that are of local and global significance. And unsurprisingly, that's really quite easy to do in Guapiruvu. Very little research has been conducted in that part of the Atlantic forest. The scientists were falling over themselves to become involved with the project, because this area is so significant. And I think that just emphasizes the importance of overcoming this disconnect between the local populace who live and exist and subsist within that space, and the scientists who really want to find ways of monitoring and educating and enabling us to protect it. So what I'm suggesting is that our view of citizen science is perhaps not entirely conventional, because actually we want to rethink it in terms of how we build citizenship as part of being able to deliver the science. And in building citizenship, you create a range of opportunities that is not simply linked to collecting data for the scientists. How many frogs and toads there are within a mile kilometre, the type of habitat, whatever it might be. It is something far more than that. And I think that really is where it begins to challenge what we think by responsibility. Who is responsible to and for what? And what does our intervention lead to? It's more than the sum of its parts. It creates its own powers and properties that are new and novel and challenging. And again, I'll talk about that in just a moment. So why is there a citizenship deficit in these rural communities in Atlantic forest, and in particular, the community in Guapiruvu? Well, as I say, when we think of citizen science, we think of participation. and the right to participate. What we found and what we argue, and this is why social science here is so important, is that we have to understand that this is a social issue. It's not simply a technical fix when we want to introduce citizen science. We have to overcome social inequalities and limitations around the rights of those individuals within these communities. And historically, the community in Guapuru has been very poorly served by the state. It has been subject to violent land reform and land battles. It remains contested in terms of who owns land and who doesn't own land. It remains contested as to how they should grow banana plants and palm hearts, which are their main sources of income. There are a number of reasons why the things that we take for granted, they can't, because of that deprivation and poverty. It's also useful to note that when the children go to school, the curricula is really urban-centric. It's designed for an urban audience, and therefore there is very little space or attention given to environmental issues and climate change. And so it is unsurprising that the children within that community have got very little inclination or knowledge of the environment, why their forest is so significant. I guess when you live in a place such as Guapuru, you become totally oblivious to what it is around you, and as the picture shows, do you put your foot beside the toad or do you tread on the toad? If you don't know why they're so significant, you might just decide that they're poisonous and the better thing to do is get rid of it. So there was a big job to do within the community. And we've been doing this work. And when I say we, my colleagues in Brazil are the ones that have spent the time on the road, going to the community month after month in building the relationships with the children, building the relationship with the farmers, building the relationship with the parents and teachers. And what they're doing is creating this communal space from the bottom up. So there have been many conversations between the children and the research team. And essentially the conversations have been about what is it they currently understand? And what is it we can bring by literally taking them out into the forest and just showing them different things within the canopy and within the floor of the forest. And we've got some excellent ecologists and science educationalists on our project who we funded and spent weekends just showing them what was important and why it was important, just to get the children familiar with and excited by. And it was always done with the involvement of of the elders within the community. It was always discussed within the community hall. It was always about the children asking questions and the team providing responses, and the team explaining why these things are important. And this project has been going since 2018, and my most recent trip out there before the pandemic was with our ecologist, Vinicius, who is an expert in frogs and toads. And we spent time with the children, explaining to them about collecting data on frogs. How do you find the frogs? How do you find the toads? And it was a fabulous experience. Vinicius is brilliant at mimicking toads, and the kids did exactly the same. And from where they might have been before this experience, where the forest was barren in terms of its interest, this was utterly transformed. So much so that we had a workshop. I think it was late 2018, early 2019. And the graphic you see on this slide is of the children drawing their own logos for their own amphibian society, which they created. We had nothing to do with. They developed it, they created it, and they actually put a float on for a environment change carnival that was run in a local town. So in other words, the conversations, the engagement, the fun and play was really important in beginning to engage them. And this picture just shows Fabio, who's in the red, and colleagues to Fabio's right, Roberto, who's the ecological scientist. The chap in the white t-shirt is Luis. He's a computer scientist from Sao Paulo. And the children sat around, boys and girls, and hopefully you can see of different ages, listening and talking about what we want to try and do with them and getting their feedback. You might be able to see on the floor two strange oblong boxes with aerials coming out of them. Well, this talks to the technology bit about trying to create an Internet Things comms infrastructure to allow them to collect data, which in itself was as exciting for the students, the children, as the actual field trip with the frogs and toads. Because not only were we looking at helping them understand how do you find these frogs and toads, for example, but we're also working with them to test how you collect data on them. And that's where our computer scientists come in. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But when we talk about citizenship, when we talk about citizen science, for us, it's about building identity and inclusion for those children that are normally excluded precisely because they don't have the educational opportunities and because they don't have the knowledge or the insight, because they've never been given the opportunity to gather that and to be part of that world. So for us, from a social science-led perspective, this is really significant because we're working from a deficit. We have to take a place-based approach. We have to understand context. And as a research team, that's taken us 2 years, building up that understanding, the nuances, the politics between the mayoral office, the municipal education element, the cooperative movement. How do all these different actors and stakeholders operate within that space? And in that sense, it's about engagement with the kids, and it's about fun. Most importantly, we're working with children. I always think of fun as a key institution. It's how we communicate, it's how we engage. We may lose part of that kind of ability as adults, but as children, fun is key and crucial for moderating and mediating education. And I think the team in Brazil has been phenomenal in the way in which it's made it fun and brought the kids in. By having these open discussions, we're provoking questions of the children. We're engaging in public debate. The kids have never been engaged in public debate. They've never been invited to talk about their forest and why it's important and what they can do to protect it and engage in research that enables that protection to take place. This is always about collective decisions. It's about the children talking together and agreeing together about what they should do. It's about debunking myths. It's about why would you tread on a frog? It's not poisonous, but they never knew that. It's about informing and exciting at the same time. It's about sharing meals and field trips. It's about that community engagement, and it's about the research team being in the middle of the sharing of meals and of the debate and of the talking. It's not about them and us. It's about creating that co-location. And in that sense, it's about negotiating collective tasks. And so the children have been given very important roles to play in developing, for example, the technology and testing the technology, which is what we'll come on to. Within the community, it has been very clear over the 2 years that where the children were quite fragmented and in their little niche groups, boys and girls of all ages now come together. Elder boys and elder girls help the younger boys and younger girls participate in the activities. When we ran workshops in Sao Paulo, where the children came to the university, FGV, they were put into groups and the elder children helped the younger children. This created a really very new dynamic within the project. and it says that it's so much more than just counting frogs. This is this citizenship element to it. It's creating a new dynamic. It's emergent, in my words, in terms of creating new properties and opportunities and possibilities. And of course, inquiry-led learning is such a better way to learn. You're working with the scientists to help inform particular research questions, which remain live and important within the case study over time, so that they can be carried over by different generations of children or different year groups within the schools. So, so the social science bit is, as I say, trying to create that context, and of course you slide in, or you nest the other sciences within that. I'm kind of pleased that I can't see. I think I've got some colleagues from computer science in the audience at the moment, probably, and I'm slightly concerned that I'm trying to talk to their expertise and their knowledge, but I'm going to talk in very simple terms that only I can understand, because as my colleagues will, I'm sure, share at some later stage, I'm really not very technically able. Anyway, in collecting data in a forest space, and you can see in the picture here that they've carved out a football pitch, but the forest comes up to the football pitch completely, and you can't see more than 5 feet into the forest, and then it's completely obscured. And so that makes it difficult for collecting data anyway. It's very wet, it's very dense, it's very difficult to have pens and paper in that environment for the kids to try and collect things. Things get rubbished and wet and destroyed. So this seemed to be a perfect opportunity to work with our computer scientists to build an infrastructure that would allow the children to collect the data. And essentially, my friends Catherine, Omar, Luis, Une, came up with the idea of an IoT communication platform based on Raspberry Pis. And these are kind of the network hubs. The information comes in, and they can communicate these between different phones that you have, mobile phones that you can have. So what we did or Une did, was to build a messaging app that would able to connect collection of data, so that we could have a kind of a trail of points of communication that could take data from being collected by kids in the forest back to a central point, which could be a Linux machine that would collect the data. And that was the theory. And of course, this was another opportunity to work with the kids. Another chance for us to show them, what involvement in science and citizen science could be. And it was probably the funniest day I've ever had, because for most of it, I could shout further the message that we were trying to communicate through the smartphone application. We did solve it in the end, and we got up to 220 meters through the dense forest. And the top picture shows you that we ran a number of experiments, and we got the kids to do the messaging, to do the running between the different points, to make sure that the messaging got through, and to collect the data. And this was for me a remarkable experience, because we spent all day. It was hot. It was humid, and the kids didn't complain once. What was particularly interesting about this time is that the colleagues that I've been working with at Cardiff in the computer science department, Omarana and Catherine Jones, Catherine was able to join me on this particular trip, and it became very, very obvious and very quickly that for the most part the kids were far more interested in Catherine than they were me. And in particular, the girls were really interested that Catherine was a scientist, was a computer scientist, and that she was here doing this type of work. And there was a real, I think, significance in the discussions over the lunch and the dinner between the children and her, translated by Fabio and Mario, as to what she was doing and why she was doing it. And this is significant because we found out later on that a lot of the girls were going back to Fabio and the Brazilian team. A lot of the girls were going back and saying, do you know what, I'd really like to find out more about computer science and ecology. And these were discussions that I don't think were had before. Now, I don't want to overstretch the claim that the significance of it, but I think it is important, because they were being part of something that they had never been given the opportunity to be part of. Now, that they live in a very gendered existence in those sorts of communities, a very traditional Catholic church, very traditional patriarchal rules, and what was being shown to them was something very, very different. And it was very encouraging to hear even the youngest of girls talking about the interest they had in the forest now and the science. So finally, in terms of the team, of course, we need ecological scientists from the natural sciences, and here we are wholly dependent on our Brazilian colleagues in Sao Paulo. And we're very fortunate because we have a number of scientists interested in amphibians and reptiles, that's Vinicius. We have mammals and the bee population. And there's a real demand and cry for research in this area. And there's a real excitement to be working in the community in the way that is being proposed, because it wouldn't work otherwise. The distances are too long, and the opportunity to work with the school children and the teachers to help, frame the research and monitor the research shows real promise. So transforming education. So it's building these relationships, I guess. The children are now self-organizing, they're self-motivated, they're better informed. They no longer squash frogs and toads on the pathways. It's a different space. They're really enjoying working with the scientists, and we're very fortunate we've got great scientists who are working with them who really engage and are interested in the children as much as the actual the science. And I think that says a lot about where Brazil is in many ways, which is a lot of these communities have been forgotten and left out, and this is a chance to shift that. The children love to be given the chance to work with the comms team and work with the infrastructure, and this is creating new space for us to work with the teachers. And the teachers are really excited because they can see how this can feed into their curricular innovations themselves. So this new context, as I say, it's about learning. Children want to learn, and they want to learn about things that perhaps they never had the opportunity to engage with before, and particularly for the girls around computer science and ecology. This is a very exciting space to be in at the moment. So that's, excuse me, that's the project as it stands. And I know I've only got a few more minutes, so I'm only going to spend 5 minutes on the responsible innovation bit. But I think there's an opportunity, because for the audience here that are academics, in particular natural science or engineering academics, there is an increasing push for us to engage in this notion of responsible innovation, which I say are projects that are socially desirable with a positive public impact. And I would, of course, say that I think this project that we've got at the moment is precisely that. It is socially desirable, important, significant, and it should have a positive public impact because of the way in which it can help transform the attitudes, but also the educational experience of children, that will inform debate within communities about how they think of their forest and how that informs how the cooperative operates in terms of its farming production, etc. But responsible innovation is framed, and I just wanted to talk about this framing and see how we're attending to that framing. And it's framed around these notions of anticipation, reflecting rather, engagement and action. Anticipation is about the possible outcomes. How can we kind of monitor those and be aware of what they are and be cognizant of the significance of them. To reflect on that, which is precisely to continue to question the purpose of the research and why we're trying to do it. And then opening up and engaging in a much broader debate. And through that process, feeding that back, shaping the innovation process that is more responsive and more open, very much not top down, very much bottom up. That's very appealing and highly problematic in its formulation. And I just wanted to start to map out this. I'm not going to go into considerable detail. We haven't got time, as I say, but I just wanted to share this with you. When we think about responsible innovation, for me as a social scientist, it's about understanding your context. And as I've set out here, for us, it's about overcoming the citizenship deficit. And so in other words, there are pieces of work around innovation which are not simply the technical fix. It's not simply about introducing the comm system within the forest and working with the kids, finding out whether a signal goes 220 meters or not. That would never be possible unless we were cognizant and aware of the citizen deficit that was in place at that time. And that really shaped how we then designed the project, which is what I've described. In other words, when we think about innovation, it's more than the sum of its parts. It's about the new relationships that emerge. It's about building new knowledge, and some of that's technical knowledge, but some of that's also social understanding. It's far more nuanced. It's about relationships. I mentioned play. Play remains such an important part of the innovation, and a mechanism through which the children can themselves engage in the debate. And whilst that might be trivial, it's so not trivial, because it's exactly how the children learn to be involved. And as part of the project team, we need to be able to facilitate and protect that space. And in that sense, it creates new possibilities, and the kids have new conversations. And so when we think about anticipating the purpose of the project, if we were simply to take it from the citizen science angle as something that's about collecting data and building knowledge and educating, then we would only capture part of the implications of the work. And in that sense, the public impact. And when we talk about public impact, it's political and it's contentious and not straightforward. So when we look at that, I've just drawn out a couple of points that I think has becoming to emerge and becoming part of that public process of the citizen science work. So this project is really calling into question the scope of the curriculum in municipality. In other words, we're increasingly becoming engaged in debate with the municipality about their curricula in a broader sense. And that I would argue is a really positive thing of what's come out of this work. What's more perhaps challenging is that in talking about environmental crisis, we're challenging the local farmers to think about how they farm. And this is challenging convention. This is challenging people that live in a subsistence way for the most part, whose only income is banana production. And obviously volume is where you make money. And so there's a question here for them in terms of, well, how much banana do we want to produce? How do we want to produce it? You know, what are our expectations as farmers? And that's a really lively debate. And we've only begun to touch upon that. The role of technology in terms of inclusion and exclusion, concerns of elders about technology being developed and what that might mean for the children, about accessibility to the wider web. Really live conversation here about, where do we draw the lines of what we develop? Future in terms of ecotourism, to what extent does this work allow us to create a new kind of sector within the Kwapuavu economy? Again, very lively about who would be involved and how that would be organized. And then finally, I think, and for me, the kind of the most interesting and in many ways challenging is how this work has challenged gender norms in terms of the role of the young women and the girls in the community, how they see themselves, seeing education as a way out of the community potentially, rather than staying in it and having families. And of course, anticipation around what you do and outcomes is about who you talk with. And the silent voice so far in our project is the church. And that's really significant because the church is very significant within the community. It's very evangelical, and we've had no traction with the church. And so our ability to anticipate is itself then constricted because we're not having the broader conversations that maybe we should be thinking about. My final slide and I'm aware of the time, so I'm just going to say that when we think about responsible innovation, we think about building a understanding of context, and that takes time. I know it's an easy thing to say and almost throwaway, but it really is significant. And all I wanted to show here is that, you know, our team has grown in understanding from 2016-17 through to starting the project in 2018, to the point at which we built the relationships around trust and a variety of activities, not just this project. In other words, as a research team, we spent a lot of time just trying to build understanding and reliance and expectations. And within that, we've tried to work with the communities from the bottom up. So we've always landed ourselves into the community. The debate has started with the community. We've shaped and guided it, but it's always been a feedback process, and that continues to be the case. So we are where we are up till now because, of course, we hit COVID, and that has really slowed up our ability to continue that work. We have a very substantial funding bid in at the moment, and we wait to hear whether or not we get any traction with that. But I think I'm going to leave it there now, Alice, and open it up for any questions. Is that okay?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Will I stop sharing now?
Yes, you can do, or you can leave the slide up. It's entirely.
Yeah, well, as I say in the slide, I just wanted to thank TC for inviting me to talk about this work. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, lovely. It was really interesting to hear about the project. We've got a couple of questions, so I'll go to those in the order that they've come through, and then if anyone else has got anything, they can have a think about that while we're addressing the first few. Okay. So the first question is from Hannah, and it says, understandings of environment and nature are highly cultural, with people communicating how they relate to the forest, for example, in very different ways. Perhaps what you identify as a deficit in their understanding of their environment and its significance is a product of not asking the right questions or not allowing them to express how they understand their surroundings in their terms. Did you seek to avoid imposing Western or European thinking about the environment?
That's a really good question, Hannah. And we spent a lot of time asking the children to draw the forest and to paint pictures of the forest as they saw it, how they felt about it. We wanted them to come to us with their impressions and understandings of what the forest meant. And that's something we continue to try and encourage. So no, I understand what you're saying in terms of imposing a particular view. I feel quite confident that in encouraging them to talk about what they see the forest to be. So I gave the example of the frogs. You know, the girls, many girls and boys would laugh about squashing the frogs. And then we would then take from that as the starting point to then talk about the frogs, and then take them out into the forest and find the frogs. And we, as I say, we have an ecologist who talked about the habitat. And so we try to, engage in a dialogue between, our view of what the forest is about and their experiences. And it's in that space that we've begun to think about and structure what sort of data we might collect and get their views on it, really. I hope that goes some way to answer your question, Hannah.
Thanks, Tim. That's great. So I suppose a similar question along slightly different lines next from Junior says, hello, it sounds like the children in the Indigenous community have internalised Western scientific values. Might the most meaningful intervention entail some accounting of how their parents and ancestors became disconnected from the land? Yeah,
that's a really good point, because this community has been subject to violence and terrible circumstances, and part of the discussions is with community elders, and they talk about their experiences of growing up in the forest. They talk about their experiences of how the forest was incredibly vibrant in terms of animals and insects and flowers, and how that's changed. And so there is a historical element to all of this, Junior, where we're very keen to not start with the citizen science and we're going to collect data from the scientists. It's start with the children, talk about where they live, and draw in all these insights from those that have lived in the location for 30, 40, 50 years. So that's a very good question, and I know that's been very important to us. And I guess it's because we're social science led that we're very keen to try and engage with these types of issues, and to recognize that when we talk about context, we're talking about history and we're talking about politics too. The citizen science bit feeds out of that, and our scientists are then informed by that debate. And I think that's a key part of this co-creation element about building identity, which is to understand what they see and feel, and then reflect on that in terms of how the project progresses.
Great, thank you, Tim. That's brilliant.
Okay.
Another few questions to get to. So we've got a question from TC that says, Tim, awesome to see this work. It's a great project. When you discuss the challenges, I was curious to know more about what might happen in the future, i.e. when you leave. Where are the key challenges for transformative change?
So I think for us, it's how we feed into the community as a set of skills and understandings. The community is very vibrant in debate. It discusses public issues. Children have been excluded from that. We're hoping that that's now gradually changing. And part of our project moving forward is to build it into the different generations of children, the year groups that are coming through, so that it becomes an ongoing debate, as Junior says, between the past and the present and what the future might look like. Building into the curricula is another way of contextualizing the environmental debate. The move where suddenly nature has become far more prevalent as a space to discuss how people live. And for us, the citizen science bit is about giving it life and something that's longitudinal, because it feeds back into the science, which is an incredibly important live debate, but it feeds back into the local politics, because this becomes evidence. And if we can feed it back into the schools, then it becomes more structured, becomes more apparent, becomes more fixed. My feeling is that our project is something that we want to roll. It's not it's not a 2-year thing. It's not a 3-year thing. Certainly in Sao Paulo, the work that my colleagues are doing there is bringing in master's students, undergrad students working in the community on an ongoing basis. In that sense, it's a live space, and represents, not that I particularly like the idea of a model of doing this, but it certainly shows an example of how it might be done.
Lovely, thank you, Tim. We are almost at time. We've got one more question, so I'll get to that, and I'll just give everyone a last chance now. If you've got anything you'd like to ask, then please add it. We'll get to it if we've got time. So the next question is from Nick, and it says, in an effort to address the inadequacies of the deficit model, scholars and practitioners often utilise alternative forms of public engagement, including the contextual model, the public engagement model, and the lay expertise model. Did you think along these lines?
So I'm not entirely familiar with the models, so I'll put my hand up on that one first. So I'll answer you in a kind of more lay perspective, and then see what you think. We certainly involved the local elders in talking to the children about the politics of their community. One of the guys, Gilberto, I think is known as he's called the bee man, or the children refer to him as someone who is the elder and the knowledgeable person within the community about the forest. And we engage in that informal type of conversation, but we also talked very formally about how the technology could work, and how that could be built into a particular project, and the researchers are talking about particular research questions. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but for me, there's a kind of hybridity here where there are various elements that are nested in the way in which we've approached it. We can't ignore the science bit, but we can't ignore the lay bit, either local knowledge, the kind of informality. And what we're trying to do in the way in which we engage the children in the community through having shared meals and events is to try and splice those together in a way that makes sense both to the scientists but also to the individuals in the community.
Lovely, thank you very much, Tim. We've got one final question, I think, from Alice. So she says, thank you for the interesting presentation. I found your comment of surprise that the children weren't aware of the significance of their environment from a global conservationist perspective. Why would they be aware? Oh, sorry, my questions have just jumped, 1 second.
It's okay.
Why would they be aware? And what does this tell us about the different experiences of the global and local? It's interesting.
Yeah. I was surprised because obviously I came in with a privileged position, thinking that everyone who lived in a rainforest that was a biodiversity hotspot would know about that, and that clearly wasn't the case. My reflections on that is the nature of the educational provision and just really how the children are involved in the community. No, you're right. There's no reason why they should, but I guess our role is to help them understand, because they're the future within that community and the future of the forest. And if given the politics of Brazil at the moment, and deforestation is encouraged still, and industrial agriculture, it continues to be encouraged in the way that it is, then you wonder what the future holds for that particular community, which, as I say, given where they are at the moment, there's real concerns over the future of the forest, if it's seen by many as becoming a desert. And I couldn't see that. Obviously, I was there and I couldn't believe how amazing it was. But for some there, they were, really, really sad and upset. But you're right. I think that engagement with them is part of what we're trying to do, and to see whether or not they see it as being important or not.
Great, thank you, Tim. Okay, we've got one final question, and then I think we'll call it there because we are at time. So questions from Jay. It says, the squashing of the frogs reminds me of the treatment of the elderly in parts of the UK. I'm involved in a health and social care project aimed at building curative bridges between the past, elderly ancestors, and the present youths here. I'd be interested, I would welcome an opportunity to explore the Brazil project. So yeah. I guess perhaps someone who maybe preferred, would enjoy discussing this in more detail offline.
No, I'd be very happy to do that. I'd be very happy to do that. I think what's key here is the importance of history and the kind of lived experience, and that's, I guess, what we're trying to understand, but also build into the project, and that's where the debate then pivots, which is, the use of technology. Where will that go? What does that include? Does that exclude? Who has voice? Why is the church not engaging with us? We tried very hard. It's not happening. And so what are we missing? I don't want to, suggest that this is a ideal model or the way that it should be done. I'm just reflecting on how we're doing it, because we do want to take into consideration history, and we do want to take into consideration the politics of science and education. And I'm not an expert in that. I'm a social scientist. I'm a critical management theorist, but I think I understand politics, and I think I understand power, and I think this plays out hugely in this environment. And we as individuals that are intervening in that space, we create affordances to do things and sometimes not to do things, and we need to be open to figuring out what they are and being aware of it, and if needs be, stopping what we're doing if the outcomes become too contentious. And that's, again, a part of the debate. But I'd be very happy to talk about your age-related project, because I think the ideas cross different contexts and different venues and subject matters, certainly.
Thanks very much, Tim. We can certainly share contact details following the session, so that's great. I think that's a really good note to end it on. So I'd just like to say thanks again to Tim for joining us today, and thank you for everyone who's attended and for all the interesting questions. It was yeah, really interesting to hear more about the project and think about it in a bit more detail. So I will end it there and remind everyone that if you would like to watch it back, then it should be online in about a week or so's time. And if you've got any further questions for Tim or want to be put in touch, then do let us know and we'd be happy to kind of facilitate that.
Thank you, Alice.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.